Today's the day we talk about the Rayquaza Gold Star once again. Today's the day I can finally say that this card has overtaken the first edition base set Charizard as being more expensive. And I'm not throwing any shade on the Charizard. It's a gorgeous, beautiful card. It started everything. I'm going to take you for a walk through some PSA, CGC, and Beckett pop numbers. The Rayquaza, there's not many of them out there. There are under 2,000 copies of the Rayquaza that have been graded across Beckett, CGC, and PSA. So I did the math earlier. There are 1,400 copies that have been graded with PSA. There have been 358 copies that have been graded with Beckett, and then CGC doesn't add it up for you, so I had to do the math. 215 copies have been graded with CGC, coming out to a total of 1,991 copies of the Rayquaza that have been graded across those three grading companies. And now I'm going to show you something, and don't be shocked, but if I were to say that the Rayquaza was miles and miles more scarce than the Charizard, would you believe me? There are 5,000 copies of the Charizard just graded with PSA. And I'm not going to bother looking at the Beckett and CGC numbers, but if we go by kind of the trend of the Rayquaza, there's probably another 2,000 between Beckett and CGC, so 7,000 copies we'll say. There are many more copies of the Charizard than the Rayquaza. And so that's why I'm gonna go over to eBay and show you the sales of a few PSA copies. When I look at sales, I like to use PSA. I think PSA is the best reference to price because it is the most, most cards are graded with PSA. As we just saw, there's like 10 times more copies graded with PSA than with Beckett of the Rayquaza. So we'll look at PSA 8 here. The last PSA 8 sold for $16,714. The last PSA 8 of the Charizard sold for $16,700. That is a $14.88 difference, which is neck and neck. They are right by each other. You know, I'm not basing this off of one grade. We'll look at a PSA 7 compared to a PSA 7 Charizard and see that the Charizard, these are shadowless in German. Don't mind it, doesn't matter. The last sold PSA 7 in English sold for $12,600, and then the last sold PSA, there's a few here, so one sold for $12,800, which is higher, one sold for $14,800, which is higher, and then on the dot the same price was paid for the two of them in a 7. And so we'll do one more and we'll look at PSA 6. Last sold PSA 6 first edition Charizard sold for $7,000. The last sold Rayquaza PSA 6 sold for $9,000. $9,000 again, weird, same price. Yeah, you know, a few $1,000s difference there. The Rayquaza is selling for more in these mid to high grades. I know we don't see many sales of the Rayquaza in a PSA 9. There is one sale on eBay, $24,500, and then the Charizard, there are no sales, but the Charizard sells in that range. It sells a bit higher sometimes. So the Charizard is more expensive in a 9. I think it's because we see more volume of sales than the Rayquaza. The numbers are there. The Rayquaza sells for more in those mid to high grades, and I didn't look at low grades, but a PSA 1, we can even look at a PSA 1 sale of the Rayquaza. PSA 1 in June sold for $3,000. Yeah, there's a 4 for $45. Beckett 6 in June. Okay, so yeah, there's not many sales of the 1, but in PSA 6, 7, and 8, the Rayquaza was selling for more. I think it's interesting to see this because I think the next public PSA 10 sale is going to shock us all. I don't think it's going to be more than the Charizard right off the bat, but I think in the future, maybe a few years, maybe 2 years, we'll see the Rayquaza consistently sell for more in a PSA 10 than the Charizard does. And it's just tough. Like, we're not going to see many sales of these cards in either grade or for either of these cards in a PSA 10 because the pops are low. The 47 holders of this card in the 10, they probably don't want to sell it, and they probably might never want to sell it because this isn't a card where we're going to see more PSA 10s pop up. Nobody's pulling the Rayquaza in the following years. I know there was one pulled this year by Clover Cards, I think. Shout out to them. I love their content. One was pulled by them this year. I think the last one was pulled by someone on Leonhardt's channel, and that was in 2021 or even 2020. That was during the COVID boom. But yeah, this card's not getting pulled. There's not a lot of EX Deoxys out there to begin with. The EX era is a scarce era era. People had things like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic and Digimon and all sorts of things to compete with Pokemon. I remember myself there, I went through phases of Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Ultimately stuck with Pokemon because Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of just went downhill. There wasn't many EX Deoxys boxes printed. There's much more of the first edition boxes that were printed. Also keep in mind, this card you'd pretty much pull in every box. The Rayquaza you'd pull in every like 3 boxes or so. I don't know, the Gold Star pull rates are kind of all over the place. Some people say 1 in every 2, some people say 1 in every 3 boxes. And then yeah, I guess if you want a specific Gold Star, it's like 1 in every case. There's not many of these out. Let's assume there's no raw copies floating around, which there are, but we'll assume that most of the copies are graded because as they should be, it's an expensive card. There's a few thousand copies of this card at most. Another thing to take away from this is if you're looking at investing in cards, I think you should always be looking at pop numbers. It's something to look at and it's fun to look at. You know, you'd be surprised if you look at pop reports on some cards and realize that there's really not many of this stuff out here. If you look at vintage, a lot of vintage is scarce. So I have this card. I purchased it recently after I realized how scarce of a card this was. And this is a set I am trying to master set, and I do appreciate this card because it's the only reverse holo in EX Deoxys that has the foil over top of the Pokemon, and it's very fitting for who the Pokemon is. Diamond eyes go really well with this holo pattern. When I looked at the pop numbers for this card, there's 17 in the world of the Sableye and then 63 9s in the world. And so I like that. I like having something that not everybody has. Unless it's a card like this, I don't care how many people have this card. I don't care what the price of this card is. I know there's a lot of them out there, and I know that it's still an expensive card, and that works for me, but it's one of my favorite cards of all time. And so the biggest takeaway, I think, is the numbers have started to speak in Pokemon, and this card has only started to sell for more than the Charizard, and I don't think it's going to stop. I think a lot of people are kind of, myself included, I'm annoyed with how many times Pokemon prints this artwork. If I want a Charizard, I don't care if it's a reprint. I'm gonna go and get the original base set or like a shadowless copy or even a first edition copy in a low grade. Pokemon's really overplayed it, and I'm not saying that's the reason why this card's catching up because it's been printed once or whatever. This card is a beautiful card in its own way, and it is just as important in its own way. There's lots of things that align with this card for it to be an expensive card. I think we're gonna see this card sell for $500,000 in the next maybe even year. I don't even know what the rate Pokemon's going at. I think the prices of this card are not due to inflation. I think it's due to people realizing what this card is. People looking at the history of this card and realizing what set it came in. EX Deoxys, a super, super scarce era of Pokemon. And so I'll leave it at that. Let me know what you think in the comments. I really appreciate everyone that's been commenting recently. It makes it feel more like I'm talking to a crowd, and I love engaging in your thoughts and having fun with this. This is what it's all about. So let me know what you think of this situation. I think there's gonna be people on both sides of the fence, Rayquaza lovers versus Charizard lovers, but at the end of the day, they're both beautiful cards. It's just the reality of collecting. We all have opinions, and we all like to share opinions. Today, I shared my opinion, but I also looked at some numbers to hopefully support it and validate my opinion. Let me know what you think. It's been fun to talk about this. Thanks for watching.